Since the creation of the first atomic bomb in 1945, humanity has entered a critical new phase. The possession of nuclear weapons has created the possibility that at any moment human civilization could be destroyed. There have been other threats to humanity's survival, but now such destructive power was in the hands of humans. For the past 78 years, we have managed to avoid the worst possible outcomes of this technology, but that result was never certain. In this video, we will review the history of this nuclear era and some of the key events and developments that have taken place. First, we will look at the effects of nuclear weapons and the many different ways that they can cause deaths. From the instant a nuclear bomb is detonated, several processes are set in motion that each create different sources of lethality. This is a result of the fact that the energy of the explosion is released in different forms. Initially, most of the energy is in the form of electromagnetic radiation. This energy comes from the nuclear chain reaction that takes place within the weapon's explosive material. The electromagnetic radiation instantaneously vaporizes everything near the explosion, creating an intensely hot fireball made of plasma. The fireball reaches temperatures as high as those on the sun. The heat from this fireball emits more electromagnetic radiation called thermal radiation. This creates the first wave of destruction. There is an intense flash of light that causes fatal burns and can even cause certain materials to ignite, starting fires in the surrounding area. A second wave is created as the intense heat of the fireball also causes an abrupt increase in pressure that initiates a shock wave. The shock wave is made of a high-pressure front followed by extreme winds. It can destroy almost anything in its path and is responsible for most of the damage and deaths of the explosion. The fireball itself rises rapidly into the atmosphere due to its extreme heat. It carries with it dust and other particles from the explosion, as well as water vapor from the surrounding air, and forms a mushroom cloud. Around 15% of the energy released from a nuclear explosion is from radioactivity. Some of this radioactivity is emitted shortly after the explosion, while the rest is released in the days, months, and years after. Most of this radioactivity is from the products of the nuclear chain reaction. These products are very unstable and thus radioactive. In addition, some of the energy from the initial explosion interacts with molecules that are near the bomb when it is detonated, causing them to become radioactive. This includes the materials of the bomb itself, as well as dirt from the ground below the explosion. These materials, combined with the products of the nuclear reaction and any remaining nuclear fuel, are the source of radioactive contamination and fallout. This radioactive dust is carried into the air by the fireball. Some of it falls to the ground within minutes, contaminating the area near the blast, while some is carried high into the atmosphere, where it is transported for many miles, leading to radioactive fallout far from the explosion. When nuclear detonations are done at ground level, they produce significantly more radioactive contamination because the ground under the explosion is made radioactive and much of it is carried into the atmosphere. Detonations that are done in the air have less material around them that is able to be made radioactive. Most of the radioactive material comes just from the weapon itself. However, detonations in the air usually have a larger, more destructive blast radius. Air detonations are most common. The first nuclear bomb that was used released 15 kilotons of energy. 15 kilotons is equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. Its destructive radius was over a mile wide. The largest bomb ever detonated, the Tsar Bomba, had a yield of over 50 megatons, or 50 million tons of TNT. Its immediate destructive radius was over 30 miles wide. However, third-degree burns were possible up to 60 miles away, and buildings over 100 miles away suffered serious damage. Most weapons today have a yield of around 100 to 500 kilotons. it is more destructive to use several smaller detonations rather than a large one of the same yield. The damage from a large-scale nuclear war would go beyond the destruction of each individual bomb. Radioactive fallout would be spread over a very large area. This would pose an immediate danger to anyone exposed to it, but it would also lead to contamination of food and water supplies. On a large enough scale, this could lead to a massive famine and many more deaths as a result. Radioactive fallout is most lethal in the days and weeks after a nuclear explosion, but some contamination would last for years. In addition, a nuclear war could cause a nuclear winter, which would further destroy food supplies. Nuclear detonations would likely start major firestorms in what remained of the many large cities that were attacked. The burning of massive quantities of oil, plastic, and other materials, as well as smoke from forests that are set on fire, and dust sent into the air by the explosions, would combine to create a massive cloud of dust. This dust cloud would block out the sun, reducing temperatures on Earth by several degrees. Temperatures could remain low for several months, several years, or over a decade, depending on various factors. It is not known how long or how intense a nuclear winter would be, as many uncertainties are involved. In the most extreme case, food production could be devastated on a global level, leading to several billion additional deaths. For people who did survive the immediate effects of a nuclear war, the long-term damage to infrastructure, food supplies, economic systems, and stability would likely prove fatal. Following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the U.S. did not have any additional nuclear weapons. There were materials to produce a third bomb, and preparations were made for its assembly, but it was never built because it became clear that the first two bombs were enough to force Japan to surrender. More bombs were built the next year, however. Around 10 were made in 1946. Several of these were used for the tests done at Bikini Atoll, which were meant to determine the effects of nuclear weapons on ships. These tests were widely publicized and attended by dozens of observers from countries around the world. They played an important role in creating public and global understanding of the significance of nuclear weapons. Over the next several years, many additional tests were conducted and new, more efficient weapon designs were developed. Production of nuclear weapons accelerated quickly. By 1948, the U.S. had 50 nuclear bombs, and by 1950, almost 300. The U.S., however, did not remain the only country with nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union began an accelerated nuclear program following the end of World War II. They were aided by information from spies who were working on the Manhattan Project. In 1949, they conducted their first successful nuclear test, and by 1953, they had over 100 nuclear bombs. The United Kingdom became the third country to develop nuclear weapons. Although the United States and the UK collaborated during World War II on developing a nuclear bomb, and many British scientists were on the Manhattan Project, the UK was cut off from the US nuclear program following the war. They decided to start their own project, which led to their first atomic bomb test in 1952. Several other countries also began to use nuclear technology, but for peaceful purposes. During the 1950s, both the US and Soviet Union opened up their nuclear programs for civilian use. They started to share their nuclear expertise with other countries, enabling them to use nuclear power for energy production. Both the US and Soviet Union sent nuclear reactors to a number of countries and trained their scientists to operate them. In the US, this was known as the Atoms for Peace program. Some countries, such as France, independently developed nuclear industries. In 1957, the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, was established. Its purpose was to facilitate the peaceful and safe use of nuclear technology. All of the early nuclear weapon designs were based on nuclear fission. Following the Soviet Union's first successful nuclear test, the United States decided to develop a fusion bomb. Fusion bombs are also called thermonuclear or hydrogen bombs. They are more complex and difficult to design, but are much more destructive and make more efficient use of nuclear material. They use a fission explosion to initiate a fusion reaction which releases far more energy. The United States tested the first fusion bomb in 1952. It had a yield of about 10 megatons, which is around 1,000 times stronger than the bomb used on Hiroshima. The Soviet Union tested their first fusion bomb the next year, in 1953. Fusion bombs became the main type of nuclear weapon. In the early period of nuclear armament, aircraft were the main form of weapon delivery. In the U.S., the Strategic Air Command was responsible for maintaining a nuclear-capable bomber force. U.S. military planners feared a massive Soviet invasion of Western Europe. The U.S. had demobilized following World War II, and many of the Western European states were militarily weak following the war. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had millions of soldiers. They felt that it would be impossible to stop such an attack, so they came to rely on a large-scale nuclear offensive as the main form of retaliation. Bomber forces would rapidly deploy to forward bases in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and other locations surrounding the Soviet Union. Strategic targets throughout the Soviet Union would then be bombed. The plan was for a full-scale attack so that the country would be completely crippled. At this time, nuclear bombs were kept in storage and under the control of the Atomic Energy Commission. Once their use was authorized, it would take several days for them to be transferred. Most targets in the Soviet Union could be hit within 3 to 6 days of the start of the war. The Soviet Union also had long-range bombers, and as their nuclear stockpile grew, they were also capable of conducting a large-scale nuclear attack. By 1948, U.S. plans called for around 50 bombs to be dropped. The next year, plans called for up to 147 bombs to be dropped, striking targets in around 70 cities. The scale of a planned nuclear offensive grew continually each year. It was essential to attack the enemy's nuclear offensive capabilities by hitting targets such as airfields, storage sites, and other nuclear facilities. As both sides increased the size of their nuclear forces, the number of targets continually increased. As a result, there was an ever-rising demand for more and more bombs. By 1953, the U.S. had over 1,000 nuclear bombs. The Soviet Union had around 120. By 1959, the U.S. had over 12,000, and the Soviet Union had over 1,000. And by 1965, the U.S. had over 30,000, and the Soviet Union over 6,000. By the mid-1950s, the U.S. had developed and deployed the first nuclear-capable rocket. This was an unguided rocket that had a limited range of only around 15 miles. There were several programs underway aimed at developing more advanced systems that had greater ranges and used guidance technology. These projects were very complex and faced numerous challenges. The major breakthrough, however, came from the Soviet Union. In 1957, they successfully launched Sputnik, the first man-made object sent into space. This was done using the R-7 rocket platform. While this was a significant achievement, the R-7's primary function was as a weapon. It was designed to be a long-range ballistic missile. It could send objects into space, but it also had the capacity to strike anywhere in the world, making it the first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, and it could easily be armed with a nuclear warhead. An ICBM attack by the Soviet Union could strike the United States within minutes. The U.S. did not have an equivalent technology operational. They were behind in the arms race. The launch of Sputnik made this clear and led to a panic within the United States. U.S. intermediate-range and intercontinental ballistic missile programs were accelerated. In the meantime, as it was clear that such an attack would have little to no warning, U.S. bomber forces were put on high alert. By early 1958, bombers were kept ready, loaded with nuclear bombs, able to launch within 15 minutes. By the end of the year, a program was in place where nuclear-armed bombers were kept in the air at all times. This kept them safe from a potential attack and ready to respond. By 1958, the U.S. deployed its first intermediate-range ballistic missiles, sending them to the United Kingdom, and in 1959 deployed its first ICBMs, the Atlas and Titan missiles. In the first few years that they were deployed, American and Soviet ICBMs had numerous limitations and were prone to errors. They were also limited in number. Newer models were developed and deployed, however, and the number of active ICBMs increased rapidly over the next few years. By 1965, the U.S. had close to 1,000 ICBMs. At the same time, technology enabling nuclear ballistic missiles to be launched from submarines was also developed. Soviet nuclear-armed submarines were deployed in 1958 and U.S. submarines in 1960. The U.S. submarines were armed with 16 nuclear warheads each. Submarines play a key role in the strategy of nuclear war. In the event that one side initiates a surprise attack, they can expect to receive a retaliatory strike from the enemy's submarines. Even if they take out all enemy land-based nuclear forces, the submarines, which are hidden, will still be able to counterattack. This keeps in place a state of mutually assured destruction, which discourages both sides from initiating a nuclear war. The three arms of the nuclear triad were now in place. Nuclear weapons could be launched from bombers in the air, from land-based ICBMs, and from hidden submarines positioned anywhere in the world's oceans. The time frame of a potential nuclear war had gone from a matter of days to a matter of minutes. As these new missile systems came into operation, tensions reached a peak. In 1961, the U.S. was still in the process of deploying its first generation of intermediate-range ballistic missiles. That year, missile bases were established in Italy and Turkey. In the summer of 1962, the Soviet Union, under Nikita Khrushchev, began secret shipments to Cuba to build missile facilities there. Ballistic missiles launched from Cuba could strike U.S. cities on the eastern coast within minutes of being launched. In October, U.S. intelligence confirmed that missile launch sites were being built, and on the 22nd, President Kennedy made a public statement outlining the situation. Kennedy chose to take a moderate course of action as opposed to the more aggressive suggestions that many of his military and other advisors were proposing. A quarantine of Cuba was declared, and U.S. ships began stopping and searching ships heading for Cuba. Kennedy also demanded that the Soviet Union dismantle the structures that had already been built. Tensions were very high over the next several days. The quarantine was enforced, and many reconnaissance flights were conducted over the island to assess the situation. There was still the possibility that the U.S. would respond with an aerial strike or even an invasion. While the missile sites were not fully assembled, the island was filled with Soviet forces. There were up to 40,000 Soviet infantry, along with tanks, nuclear artillery, and nuclear bombers. Soviet submarines were also operating in the area. On the most intense day of the crisis, October 27th, there were 3 close calls that almost led to all-out war. In the morning, an American reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba and the pilot was killed. This was an unauthorized decision by a local commander, but U.S. leaders thought the order came from Khrushchev. Military leaders pressured Kennedy to respond with an attack against the SAM site that was responsible, but he refused. Later in the day, a U.S. plane went off course over the Arctic and accidentally flew several hundred miles into Soviet airspace. This could have been seen as the start of a major U.S. attack, but luckily it wasn't. The most extreme incident involved a Soviet nuclear-armed submarine. The submarine had been out of contact for several days and was being hunted by U.S. ships. The captain came to believe that a war had already started and wanted to attack using nuclear weapons. This required the authorization of 3 officers on the ship. 2 of the 3 agreed to do so, but because one of them refused, they held off. Throughout this standoff, both Kennedy and Khrushchev came to be vividly aware that a full-scale nuclear war could be ignited at any moment. With tensions at such a high level, any mistake or miscommunication by forces on either side could lead to total escalation. If a war did start, it would likely begin unintentionally. The situation was largely out of the control of both leaders. The crisis came to an end due to Kennedy and Khrushchev's desire to avoid war and willingness to accept a diplomatic compromise. Communications were exchanged between the 2 leaders over several days, and they came to an agreement. Khrushchev told Kennedy on October 28th that the missile sites would be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. Kennedy made a public announcement promising that the U.S. would not invade Cuba. Kennedy also agreed in secret to remove the missiles that were stationed in Turkey. With the conflict coming to a peaceful conclusion, there were some positive outcomes. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were eased somewhat. Both sides saw the importance of communication and agreed to establish a permanent hotline so that secure and rapid communication was possible. This would allow for de-escalation in the event of future emergencies. But ultimately, the arms race continued. New technologies were developed that provided more effective and diverse ways of delivering nuclear weapons and increasing their destructive power. Newer generations of missiles were capable of separating so that warheads from a single missile could strike several targets. Nuclear cruise missiles were also created, which, because they can fly low in the atmosphere, can be difficult to detect and could be used for a surprise attack. Nuclear weapons technology also began to spread to other countries, which created further opportunities that a nuclear war would break out. There are 2 main pathways for creating a nuclear weapon. They can be made using uranium or plutonium. To create a uranium weapon, natural uranium must be processed to extract uranium-235, which is the usable isotope. This is called enrichment. Alternately, the uranium can be used to power a nuclear reactor which produces plutonium. The plutonium can then be extracted and used to make a plutonium-based weapon. Both of these processes require the construction of very advanced facilities and a high level of technical knowledge. Many countries start with a civil nuclear program and use the knowledge from this to begin a weapons program. Obtaining the nuclear material is generally the most difficult step in the process. After that, a bomb must be designed. A uranium bomb can be made with a relatively simple design. Plutonium bombs, however, require a higher level of complexity. In total, 10 countries have successfully developed nuclear weapons. France became the 4th country to do so. The French government strongly supported the development of a nuclear industry in the late 1940s and 50s. By the late 1950s, they decided to pursue a nuclear weapons program. It was hoped that this would assert French independence and give them a stronger position on the world stage. In 1960, they successfully launched their first atomic bomb. For similar reasons, China also pursued nuclear weapons. They were initially aided in their research by the Soviet Union, but as the relationship between the 2 countries broke down, China proceeded on its own. In 1964, they succeeded in their first nuclear test. They tested their first nuclear-capable missile in 1966, and the next year detonated a hydrogen bomb. China declared that their official nuclear policy was that they would under no circumstances be the first to use nuclear weapons. They were unique in this stance, both US and Soviet policy allow for a nuclear first strike. Israel also developed a nuclear program in the 1960s. They were aided by France in developing their nuclear industry, and in secret also began to work on a bomb. It is thought that sometime between 1965 and 1968 they produced their first nuclear bomb. Israel has never acknowledged that they have nuclear weapons, and even claimed that they do not. India became the 7th country to develop nuclear weapons. They tested their first bomb in 1974. The test was meant to show the capability of Indian scientists and to prove that India was equal to the other major nations that had already created the bomb. India was widely condemned following the test and was cut off from international supplies and support for its nuclear industry. They did not attempt to militarize the technology and build a nuclear arsenal until several years later. India was followed by South Africa in the early 1980s. There were large uranium ore reserves in South Africa, and in exchange for supplying the U.S. with uranium, they received support for their nuclear industry during the 1950s and 60s. As South Africa became politically isolated due to international condemnation of their apartheid system, they began to pursue a weapons program starting in 1974. They received support from Israel, again taking advantage of their large supply of uranium. By the early 1980s, they had constructed their first bomb. In total, they produced 8. In 1989, a new president was elected, and the apartheid system began to come to an end. At the same time, South Africa chose to disassemble its nuclear bombs. Following several military defeats and India's successful nuclear test in 1974, Pakistan began a serious effort to obtain nuclear weapons. They wanted to make sure that they stayed on the same level as India. Their nuclear weapons program made significant progress during the 1980s and 90s. They received support from China, and in 1990, China conducted a nuclear test for them of a Pakistani bomb. In 1998, as a show of force, India conducted a second set of nuclear tests. These were the first tests since 1974 and included a hydrogen bomb. Within a few weeks, Pakistan responded by conducting its own tests, confirming that they were now a nuclear power. The most recent country to develop nuclear weapons was North Korea. In 1985, they signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There were questions about their compliance, and after years of negotiations and a failed agreement with the U.S., they withdrew from the treaty in 2003. In 2006, they conducted their first nuclear test. Negotiations continued, but did not accomplish much. They conducted several more tests in the following years, and also invested in a missile program, which led to the development of an ICBM in 2017. Several other countries have also attempted to develop nuclear weapons. These include Brazil, Canada, Sweden, Libya, Iraq, and others. They abandoned their programs for various reasons, such as the cost and technical challenges, public opposition, risk of isolation, and pressure from the international community. Countries that pursue nuclear weapons are often faced with strong pressure, including sanctions and trade embargoes, which makes doing so a major risk. Most recently, Iran has faced serious scrutiny over concerns that they could develop nuclear weapons. During the 1990s and 2000s, they developed an advanced uranium enrichment program. For the most part, enrichment was done to around 5% or less. However, eventually, they conducted enrichment up to 20%. Uranium enriched to above 20% could be used to make nuclear weapons. The international community worked hard to get them to limit their level of enrichment. After years of negotiations and sanctions, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was adopted in 2015. Iran agreed to limit its uranium enrichment and allow for inspections of its nuclear facilities. For several years, Iran kept to its side of the agreement. However, in 2018, the United States withdrew from the treaty. The other parties attempted to keep the treaty in place, but because the U.S. began imposing sanctions again, Iran had no reason to maintain its commitments. As a result, they began enriching uranium above the level that had been set in the agreement and took other steps expanding their nuclear program. In 1963, the first Nuclear Weapons Regulation Treaty was signed. Negotiations initially included the possibility of a comprehensive ban, but ultimately the treaty focused only on testing. It banned nuclear explosions in the atmosphere, space, and underwater, limiting tests to only those conducted underground. It was mainly driven by public concern over radioactive fallout contaminating the air. This limited test ban treaty was signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. 5 years later, in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed by 59 countries, including the United States and the Soviet Union. Countries that did not have nuclear weapons agreed not to pursue them. At the same time, countries that did have them agreed to share nuclear technology for peaceful uses, but were prohibited from sharing nuclear weapons technology. Since it was first enacted, basically all countries have become parties to the treaty. Israel, India, and Pakistan are the main exceptions. North Korea is the one country that signed but later withdrew. Under the treaty, non-nuclear weapon states are required to reach an agreement for inspections with the IAEA. The IAEA conducts inspections for safety as well as to ensure that civilian nuclear programs are not used to enable a nuclear weapons program. The Non-Proliferation Treaty has had a significant impact on limiting the number of countries that possess nuclear weapons. However, it has not completely halted proliferation. In the late 1960s, U.S.-Soviet relations became less strained. This shift was largely led by Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev. This allowed for a series of negotiations to take place, which were aimed at ending the nuclear arms race and reducing the possibility of nuclear war. These negotiations were known as SALT, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. The initial talks lasted from 1969 to 1972. They resulted in the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty, which was signed by both countries in 1972. This treaty banned the deployment of defensive systems that could stop an incoming nuclear missile attack. If one side gained this technology, then the other's offensive capabilities would be made ineffective, and mutually assured destruction would no longer be in place. Both sides also agreed to a temporary halt on the deployment of additional ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles while additional talks took place. Tensions began to rise again in the late 1970s with the start of the Soviet-Afghan War, and nuclear discussions were disrupted. Talks were restarted in 1982, however, this time with the name START, or Strategic Arms Reduction Talks. These negotiations aimed not only at limiting, but also reducing the number of deployed nuclear weapons. Negotiations took several years, but an agreement was finally signed in 1991. There were complications due to the breakup of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. As a result, it wasn't put into effect until 1994. Russia and the United States agreed to reduce their nuclear arsenals to 6,000 warheads each, along with other limitations. Over the next several years, leading up to the 2001 deadline, both sides greatly reduced their number of nuclear weapons to reach this goal. In addition, the three former Soviet states of Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan all agreed to give up their nuclear weapons. With the START treaty set to expire, a new treaty, SORT, was negotiated and signed in 2002. It limited nuclear deployments to between 1,700 and 2,200 for each side. In 2010, the new START treaty was signed, which limited deployments to around 1,500. The number of nuclear weapons reached a peak in 1986 at over 64,000. Most of these, over 40,000, belong to the Soviet Union. The United States reached its peak level of armament in 1967 with around 31,000. After 1986, the number of nuclear weapons declined rapidly. Both countries greatly reduced their nuclear stockpiles. By 2000, the US had around 10,500 and Russia around 12,000. Today, Russia has around 4,500 and the US around 3,700. China is estimated to have around 350 nuclear weapons, France 290, and the United Kingdom around 180. India and Pakistan have around 160 each, Israel has around 90, and North Korea probably has around 20. These countries also have the materials to create many more weapons if they were needed. While the number of nuclear weapons has decreased greatly, the threat of nuclear war has not. There have been a number of close calls with nuclear weapons, caused by both technological and human error. These incidents highlight the continuing possibility that a nuclear war could be started by accident. In 1979, U.S. warning systems reported an incoming Soviet attack. This alert went through the chain of command, and U.S. nuclear forces prepared to retaliate. Luckily, it was realized that this was a false alarm. Someone had incorrectly loaded a training simulation into the system. In another incident, in 1983, a Soviet warning system detected several missile launches from the U.S. The Soviet officer who received this alert believed it was a false alarm and convinced his superiors to not overreact, which prevented an escalation. The error was caused by satellites mistaking sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile launches. Incidents like this happened regularly during the Cold War and afterwards. They are generally kept secret and not revealed until years later. Each of these events is a possibility for a nuclear war to break out. With the development of more advanced computer systems and networks, there has been an additional layer of risk due to technological errors. In addition, cybersecurity threats have also become an issue. Another area of danger comes from the possibility that a new arms race could begin as a result of advancements in anti-ballistic missile technology. The United States withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. Russia wanted the U.S. to remain in the treaty, but the U.S. refused. Technological advancements since then have made it more likely that an effective anti-ballistic missile system could be developed. If one country did develop an ABM system, other countries would likely become very concerned. They might claim that they need more nukes to overcome those defenses and could start increasing production of nuclear weapons. Technological advancements in other areas also have the potential of starting a new arms race. In February 2023, Russia announced its partial withdrawal from the New START treaty. They were no longer going to allow U.S. inspections of their nuclear facilities. However, they did state that they would continue to limit their nuclear arsenal to the numbers established in the treaty. Rising tensions between the U.S. and Russia due to the invasion of Ukraine have led to a nuclear escalation. The New START treaty was extended for 5 years in 2021, so that it is set to expire in 2026. If tensions remain at such a high level, it is unlikely that Russia will rejoin the treaty or that a new treaty could be negotiated. The future of nuclear arms limitation is uncertain. There is danger that further escalation is on the horizon.